Welcome to the Crimson Engine. My name is 𝙏𝙃𝙄𝙎. Today we are talking about the transition from photography to cinematography and all the things that you can do along the way to make that transition as smooth as possible and to enhance your cinematography skills with your photographic knowledge. We're going to look at exposure first and foremost. Then we're going to look at actually using your camera differently, how you hold it, how you mount it, how you rig it. Then we're going to look at focus, how focus is different between photography and cinematography, how to get sharp images, or how to get the part of the image that you want sharp. Then we're going to talk about how lighting, especially lighting with flash or lighting with natural light, is different than lighting with constant lighting and the type of lights that we use in cinematography. And finally, we're going to sum up and talk about the best way to make that transition and the mindset that you need to adopt when you move to cinematography, when you've been shooting photos. So let's jump in. Exposure is the number one thing that a lot of photographers get tripped up by when they move to cinematography. They try and expose with the good old exposure triangle that they learned in photography school or on their first job, and they end up with, either super bright or super dark images or footage that doesn't look right because the shutter speed is way off. There's no motion blur, there's too much motion blur, or it's really noisy. So I'm going to talk about how cinematography treats these differently. So with the exposure triangle, you have ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. Now, very quickly you find that in cinematography, you can only really use one of these and not without a cost. If you manipulate the shutter speed, and some cameras allow you to do shutter speed differently than shutter angle, overall, changing the shutter speed, especially going up to the 1,000th, 2,000th of a second that photographers can do when there's too much light, doesn't work in cinematography because it changes the shutter angle and the motion blur. So it makes your images look super staccato. It makes them look very TV-like or sports-like. It doesn't give them any of that nice, soft motion blur that you get at 24, 23 frames per second. Even the difference between 24 and 30 frames per second is noticeable. People won't know what they're looking at, but they'll just think that it looks less cinematic. If you go the other way and go down to 12 frames per second, you get kind of blurry images, and it, again, looks really weird. So you can't really change the shutter speed of your cinema camera in order to expose. You do have a little wiggle room. You can go up to 180 shutter speed to 270 to get out some more light, or that quarter of a stop, but it's not doing very much, and it quickly becomes noticeable. So what about ISO? Well, you can decrease or increase ISO. You get a lot more grain, which you can take out in post, but moving from the native ISO of the camera does affect your dynamic range. So if you start up with a 13-stop camera, like the Canon C70 I'm shooting on, and you decrease ISO 4 stops to ISO 200, you're now at a 8 to 10 stop dynamic range. So you've crushed the darks especially, and you've reduced the lights. What would have been captured as a highlight with detail is now blown out to white, and what would have been captured as a shadow is now blown out to black. So you don't really want to change your ISO too much again, unless you know what those changes are doing. You want to leave it at the native of the camera. So that leaves your aperture. But aperture is not a great tool for controlling exposure because it has one of the most noticeable effects on image quality. It changes the depth of field. Super low aperture, say T1.5 or T1.3, whatever this is, right? I'm sharp, but my background is blurry. If there was too much light in the scene and I cranked it up to even f5.6, suddenly that's a lot less blurry. There's a lot less separation between me, the subject, and the background, a lot less cinematic in some ways. If I go all the way up to f16, everything is in focus, and so you don't get that separation, you don't get that nice isolating your subject against the background. So if you can't use ISO, you can't use shutter speed, you can't use aperture, how do you expose cinematography? Well, the two big ways. If there is not enough light, you need to get more light into the scene, and that means turning up the lights that you have or bringing more lights on set. If there's too much light and you want to shoot wide open or you want to shoot on a low f-stop, but it's too bright, then you need to add neutral density. So you either add that in the camera, the C70 has internal ND, you add it between the lens and the body. There's a couple of places on the market that have both hard stop and variable ND adapters from say EF to R. And you can put it in front of the lens. You can get screw-on variable ND or hard ND. You can get matte boxes with either set plates, set 4x5 matte box plates that give you 0.3, 0.6 or 0.9 ND, which translates into 1, 2 or 3 stops. You can get variable ND for matte boxes. So you can get a piece of glass that is dark at the top and slowly fades down into clear so that you can knock down the exposure on skies and still have your subject exposed correctly. Also with exposure on cinema cameras, you need to be somewhat more accurate because there's not as much you can reclaim in post. With photography, you can pretty much do it by eye, and unless it's totally blown out, you can recover a lot in post-production in Lightroom or whatever you're using. With cinema footage, even if you're shooting raw, you have less wiggle room, so you need to get your subject exposed correctly. That means finding out what the middle gray point is for your particular sensor and in the mode that you're shooting. So then this t-shirt actually is very helpfully around middle gray, so this will sit at around 38 on the waveform, and then my skin, which happens to be a stop above middle gray, will sit around high 40s, low 50s. So my skin sits pretty much even on the waveform at 50%. Yes, if it's 70 and it's not clipping, I can bring it down. If it's 30 and not crushing, then I can bring it up. But I don't have quite as much leeway as I do photographically. So it needs to look like you want it to look near enough in camera as you want it to look on the screen. Next, let's talk about operating your cinema camera. Cinema cameras tend to be much larger than photographic cameras, though there's plenty of photographic cameras that shoot excellent video. And that's not by mistake. A small DSLR or mirrorless camera, if you're trying to shoot continuous video with it, will pick up all the micro vibrations and movements of your hands, and it translates to very shaky footage. Now, there are a couple of ways around this. The first is to use stabilization, either lens stabilization or in-camera stabilization. The C70, R5C, the Canon range have digital stabilization in camera. So it crops in on the sensor by about 10% and then uses that crop to move the image around to counterbalance what your hands are doing. Now, it doesn't give you super stable footage like you would get on a tripod, especially if you're moving around. It just takes out a little bit of the jitter and makes it that much easier for the viewer to focus on what's being shot. Digital stabilization can really help take out those small micro jitters and breath and basically make the footage that's handheld more watchable. This doesn't really apply to movement, camera movement. If you're moving with the camera, like walking around and trying to shoot your subject, you're going to get a lot more movement and it's going to look handheld. There's nothing wrong with this. If you don't want to be constantly reminding the viewer that they're watching a film and that someone's holding the camera, you'll need to work out a way to move the camera so that it's not noticeable. Now, the most popular and newest version of this is the gimbal. This is where you mount a camera on a brushless motor head, and the gimbal detects your movement and then compensates for it. So as you move this way, it moves this way. It means that you can move the camera quite a lot and still get a very nice smooth shot. Now, gimbals don't take out the walking movement of going up and down. They just take out the jiggling and the small vibrations of your hands. If you want to take that movement out, you'll need to either use a Steadicam or you'll need to walk with your gimbal in a way that doesn't go up and down. It's sometimes called the duck walk or the ninja walk. You end up walking with bent legs so that it takes out both the up and down movement and the movement of the camera. Now, gimbals are not that expensive anymore. They're not that difficult to learn. There isn't a lot of rigging and unrigging and balancing. You do it 20 times and you can do it in under about 5 minutes. They are one more thing to take care of, and it is difficult to go from shooting handheld to shooting on a gimbal to shooting handheld again. It is more gear to move with. Another way to get smooth movement is on a dolly or on a slider. These are things that you lock the camera onto either with a tripod head or directly to the unit, and then you move the unit around, sliding it back and forth, or having someone push a dolly. Very often on film sets, you'll see a camera on a small, like 2 or 3 foot slider on top of a tripod when shooting dialogue scenes. This is sometimes called an overkeeper, and it's there so that the camera operator can make the micro adjustments to space as the actor in the foreground or the actor that they're looking at moves around. So if the actor in the foreground, the one whose shoulder is in the shot, leans forward, they'll block the camera. So they usually use a small slider just to be able to slide left or slide right and keep the actor who's in the shot visible. But using a slider or a gimbal or a dolly means that the operator will have their hands full just controlling the framing of the camera. They no longer are able to focus it because they need both of their hands to move the slider or operate the gimbal. And so this means you have to rely on somebody else. And now the team starts to grow to do the focus or push the dolly. And I would say that is the largest single difference between photography and cinematography. As a photographer, you are both motivating your subject, you're giving direction, and you're operating the camera, and sometimes you're doing the lights. It is a one-person job primarily. With cinematography, you're not directing the actors. Usually it's the cinematographer or operator's job to move the camera. It's the director's job to direct the picture or the show, meaning talks to the actor, works with the producer. And as a result, cinematography is more of a team sport. It requires more people because the cameras are more complex. The process of making motion pictures, even with all the advances in technology, still requires a team. If there's one thing that really separates cinematography from photography, it's that cinematography is much more of a team sport. And as a result, collaboration is much more important. That brings us to our next subject, which is focus. Yes, you can absolutely use the autofocus in your cinema camera, much like you use it in the photography camera. And newer cinema cameras have all sorts of great options like face tracking, eye tracking, vehicle tracking. And this will get you through usually 90% of what you're shooting. In most projects, you will run across a scenario when autofocus won't work. It might be because you want to shift focus from one subject to another in the middle of a shot, or that you want to use focus to tell the story, meaning you focus on one thing and as the camera pans up, you then wrap focus to something else. You lead the viewer's eye through the frame. To do that, you will need a manual focus lens with a long focus throw, like a Cine lens, because photographic lenses often have a very small focus throw, so you can rapidly move from one place to the other. This means it's difficult to slowly roll, say, across an object, or it's difficult to roll from the foreground to the background, because literally the difference between 10-meter focus point and infinity is 1 degree on the barrel of the lens, whereas on a Cine lens it might be 20 degrees. Cine lenses are just geared differently, and they're geared especially for this purpose. Though you'll quickly find out that if you try and take your hand off where you're holding the camera, that the camera will move. So you need some kind of device on the camera itself where your hands are on the handles to move the focus, or more regularly, more often, you're having a second person called the focus puller pull focus, either with their hand on the follow focus or doing it remotely with a remote follow focus. So you can just point the camera where it needs to go, and the focus puller will automatically pull focus from one point to the next as you've rehearsed. Yes, having another dedicated crew member just to do the focus can really make the set larger. It's one more person you have to feed, have to find a car park for. Generally, it makes the team bigger, but if you're dealing with a reasonable sized budget, I would say $5,000 or more, and you're on the clock, meaning you only have the location or the talent for that one day or that 1 hour, having a dedicated professional focus puller is worth its weight in gold, because it means that you no longer have to do take after take, getting the focus just right as the person walks into frame. You have someone that does this for a living and that can do it consistently, that's going to pull focus for you. So I would say that the big difference between your focus on your stills camera and your cinema camera isn't technical. It's that on a cinema set, you'll have a dedicated person for the focus. And they also, sometimes help look after the camera. They're usually called either the first AC or the focus puller. And if you're doing multiple cameras, you will need you need that type of focus, you will need a focus puller for each camera. So when you're doing multiple cameras with cinematography, which is often a good idea because it means that you get multiple angles for the edit with one take. You don't have to do, a take with a close-up, a take with a wide, a take with a mid-shot, then reverse around. If you're able to light, which is an art in itself, light multiple camera angles at once, then you are able to cover off everything instantly without having to do multiple takes. Let's talk a little bit about lighting for cinematography versus the type of lighting that people do for photography, usually with a flash. Now, you can have a flash pop out for, a thousandth of a second and give more light than the sun, which is the equivalent of about 1 million lux. And you can buy that thing for, a couple $100. That is one of the joys of photography and what makes it so accessible. To get that same level of light in cinema is almost impossible. Not just because you need to bring in cranes to get these huge lights and bright all the way up, though if you had the level of a flash as a constant source, the subject would be so blinded by it, they would have to wear sunglasses or basically keep their eyes closed through the whole take, which you don't want. So the difference with constant lighting from flash lighting is that you typically need to use more power and use a bigger source. Why? Because with photography, you can have the flash on the camera or right next to someone's head or here, and it gives that wonderful fall off, it gives that wonderful pop. If you were to put a light that close to an actor, it's very difficult for them to act. They need a little bit more space to walk around, a little bit more space to feel unencumbered and feel natural. If softness, meaning the fall off of the light, like if you see this light here, it's quite soft, the fall off under my chin, that isn't a hard line. If I were to get this on a film set rather than a 2-camera piece, here the light is right off camera, it's really close to me. If I wanted to get this for an actor, to get that same softness, I just need to use a bigger light further away. So I have a 4-foot tube light, which is less than 2 feet from me. If I want that same softness on a film set, I need to use 2 4-foot tube lights 4 foot away, so 8 feet 2 feet away, and so on and so on. If I want to light the whole room like this and have 2 or 3 people in a group all lit with this same soft light, same direction, then I'm going to need a 10 by 10 or 20 by 10 light source 15 feet away. And as you can see, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's why on film sets you have these huge light sources. It's not because they're trying to get it really, really soft. It's because they're trying to illuminate everyone evenly with the same softness. As lights get bigger, it is harder and harder for one person to move them, reposition them, set them up and take them down. And as a result, this is why you get a dedicated crew position called the gaffer, and grips and lighting technicians and assistants. And again, the team gets bigger and bigger. There's more and more of a need to delegate. And as a result, the cinematographer is less the person doing all of this themselves and more the person planning and then executing on the plan. Now, the advantage of this is that if you're, say, shooting a shampoo commercial and you've never done one before, if you hire a gaffer that has shot 50 shampoo commercials, they're going to be able to tell you exactly what type of lights you're going to need, how long it's going to take them to set them up, how to get certain looks with certain lights and positions and placements. And so rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to need this person, it's going to cost more and more money, you really are buying a result with some things. You're going to, start to get more experience, not just of your own techniques, but also how to employ people that are going to make the work look better. Focus pullers, gaffers, grips, even operators, even other camera people that are going to be operating B camera, C camera, and make you look good, even if camera operation for a cinema camera isn't your strong suit. My last tip for photographers moving into cinematography is to not obsess about any particular image. With photography, you want that one shot to just be perfect. Your job as the cinematographer is to get all the different footage and allow the editor to tell the story by cutting those together and having the friction between the images tell the story rather than having to encapsulate the entire meaning of the film in one image, which is photography's job, but is almost impossible in cinematography. If there's one thing I could say to photographers who want to become cinematographers is to shoot as much as possible and also work with as many different people as possible to get that experience of how different people work, what they can bring to the work. You also need to be watching your own footage back and get experience with color grading software, just like you do with Lightroom, with photography, and learn to manipulate the image, learn how far the image can be pushed and pulled, what you can get away with on set. And if you're attempting to get something on set that's not there in the footage, you need to know that when you're on set, because on set you won't have the opportunity to plug the SD card or CF card in the computer and look to and to try out different grades. You'll need to know beforehand what image on set translates to the possibilities in post. Work with gaffers, work with different directors, work with different focus pullers, even work with different colorists, and get that experience. That as you build up that experience, you'll be more and more valuable to other people as a cinematographer, even if it's just for your own projects. That is my look at the transition from photography to cinematography. Hopefully it helped people out there. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.